Hello, I'm here with Rainnie, author of i4.0, 3D Printing, Deglobalisation and New Manufacturing Clusters, The View from Australia. Al, thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
First of all, and just to orient us, what are the terms in your title?
Yeah, it's my entry for the most jargon-filled Title of the Year award. i4.0 is gobbledygook, which stands for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We won't bother about 1 and 2. The third was the argument that computers, information and communication technologies drove a change in the world economy. That has sort of petered out a bit. We're now on the verge of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and that's based on things like robotics, 3D printing, artificial intelligence, and so on. And this is, it is argued, is bringing out a new industrial organization and a new world of work. Allied to that, 3D printing is essential. And what that is the idea that now that rather than simply having to go through complicated manufacturing procedures with 3D printing, where you just print layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of stuff, you can actually manufacture complex pieces of machinery, of technology, in situ, on site, rather than having to send them away. Because if you've got the artificial intelligence that's got the 3D design, you can print where you are. This, it's argued, means that the move that we saw in globalization, which saw manufacturing industries spread all over the world, particularly to low-wage economies like China, for example, they can now come home. We can reverse globalization. Manufacturing industry can now come home. It can come home in small manufacturing, high technology clusters, and this, it's argued, is a new world of work.
Just to pick up, sorry to cut you off mid-flow. Just to pick up on one thing, you frame that as a decision. Does this literature frame those deglobalization trends as something that states are pursuing actively, or something that's occurring structurally, whether they want them to or not?
It's a mixture of both.
Okay.
It's arguing that these trends are underway in the global economy. It makes sense for large organizations to pursue them, to invest in artificial intelligence, 3D printing, robotics, which then push you in the direction of deglobalization. And what it argues is that this then allows states to promote the regrowth of manufacturing industry within their own geographies, within their own spaces, in a way that simply hasn't been possible for maybe half a century.
Certainly. Okay, well, we've sort of got to the orthodox story about these things. It's worth noting that i4.0 is a term which itself encompasses a whole bunch of other bits, and 3D printing is a term which encompasses a whole bunch of other bits. So there's a lot of moving pieces here, but we do have this fairly coherent orthodox story that things like AI and particularly 3D printing were going to speed up deglobalization and this new clustering, as producers would be less reliant on global value chains and the risks and problems associated with them, and solve this problem of the offshoring of manufacturing through the past 4 decades. This is not your story. This is the orthodox story. Why do you disagree with this?
Well, can I just make one point, Michael, before we go on? Because we're sitting here in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and one of the things that's happened that is theoretically has accelerated everything that I've talked about so far is COVID-19. This is for 2 reasons. Firstly, because states became hyper aware that the value chains that produce things like the equipment you needed to clothe frontline workers was actually manufactured on the other side of the globe, and the value chains that produced that broke down. China went initially into reverse, and global value chains, it's argued, pretty much came to a standstill. And states became very, very, very aware of quite how vulnerable strategically they were in this old world. And this massively accelerated the move towards trying to bring everything strategically, defense, health, pharmaceuticals, you name it, bring it back home. Now, against this, there's a number of arguments. The first is that global value chains have not collapsed in the way. All you've got to do is look at the way that the Chinese economy, one of the few economies in the world that is booming, has continued to boom throughout the pandemic. It also shows that the value chains that have got their bases in China are still going every bit as strong as they did pre-COVID. So there has not been that move towards reshoring for that simple reason alone. The second reason is that one of the things that this belief misses out is the growth of platform capitalism, the growth of the gig economy, the growth of companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google, these behemoths that bestride the world economy now. We have gone towards a system of concentration of large firms in a way that we haven't seen at any point in history. And they have got value chains that stretch all over the world. And these, in fact, have grown in the pandemic rather than shrink. The only companies, the only corporations that have increased their profitability massively during the pandemic are the FANGs, the platform capitalism. And those companies are based in particular areas around the world, and that concentration has grown. So therefore, the idea that you can bring manufacturing back, bring organization back, is a bit mistaken. There have been attempts to do so, what was called deglobalisation. Companies did try to bring some of the manufacturing back, but this has not come back to the big industrial countries like the United States, Europe, or even Australia. Where it has gone is to countries like Mexico or Vietnam, which are closer to economies like North America, Australia, whatever, but still reliant on cheap labor. So what you've got is something that's called nearshoring, horrible jargon, but nearshoring rather than reshoring. Rather than manufacturing coming back home, it's just simply come back closer to economies that are still reliant on cheap labor, cheap skilled labor, but cheap labor nonetheless, but simply nearer to where they used to be. And the final thing that's a bit of a nail in the coffin is that one of the major developments in the global economy over the last 50 years has been the growth of massive city economies, huge city economies. And these throughout the world, throughout the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, have not only been the major determinants of growth, but they've also been the home for advanced manufacturing, for high technology industries, and for highly skilled workforces. They act as magnets, drawing these organizations and industries to them. This has not gone into reverse in the pandemic. If anything, it has accelerated. So although it's the case that if you take a country like Australia, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't get clusters of high technology industries emerging around things like defense. I'm sitting here in Adelaide. We've got naval and the submarine industries growing up around here. You might get small clusters, but they will be small. In terms of the pattern of global industry, they're going to be small, they're going to be marginal, and they're probably going to be fleeting. They're not going to be the huge centers of manufacturing strategic industry that the mythology would have us believe.
Okay, so your objections are basically empirical. Like we haven't, your objections to the standard deglobalization story are mainly based on the observation that these haven't come true yet. Is this is that one, is that true? And secondly, is that problematic given that my understanding of most of those claims in the orthodox story are projections forward?
No, they're, if you go back, organizations like the World Economic Forum, the World Trade Organization are saying these things are happening already. They're not projections. This is one of the problems with this. To be slightly facetious for a second, they come with a prescription that draws on a quite frightening mixture of the Daleks and Margaret Thatcher. From Margaret Thatcher, they get Tina, there is no alternative. And from the Daleks, they get all resistance is futile. In other words, this is not just a prescription, it's saying this will happen. Now, one of the problems, this has come in for massive criticism in Europe, huge criticism in Europe. It has not come in for any criticism in Australia yet, other than, to blow my own trumpet for a second, myself and my colleague Mark Dean have been writing about this for a while. But the government have taken it on board, Australian manufacturing industry have taken it on board, the Labour Party by and large have taken it on board. It's description and prescription and analysis all rolled into one. The argument I'm putting against it is based on forms of analysis about what's been happening in the global economy in terms of restructuring of supply chains, in the emergence of processes of urbanization in both the advanced and emerging economies that run, and demolishing some of the myths around things like 3D printing that run counter to this prescription, description and analysis, this bundle of ideas that's coming to dominate within analysis and policy. And that's what worries me, that it's uncritical acceptance of this in a way that, particularly for working people, I think quite frankly is dangerous.
Okay, well, I guess I've got one more question for you that really speaks to this disentangling of description and prescription. In the article, you draw attention to intensifying uneven development and socio-spatial exclusion. And I'll ask you to explain what you say about those two, but to turn the argument you make on its head a little bit, do you think that there is any emancipatory potential in things like i4.0 and 3D printing and deglobalisation? And to frame that just a little bit further, what conditions do you think would need to be present for things like 3D printing to have emancipatory potential for marginalized communities?
If we take the question in two bits, the first about the uneven development. In the article, we argue that the concentration of technologically based industries, the FANGs, in particular areas like California, for example, means that you get the urban development around it, which means that you get a concentration not only of the most highly profitable industries in the world, but some of the best qualified and best paid workers in the world around those things. And what that tends to happen is that other parts of the world tend to lose out. So emerging economies now are going through a process of what's called premature deindustrialization. Another piece of jargon, I know, but what it means is that the process of industrialization that the advanced economies went through has been blocked off. The emerging economies, many of the emerging economies find that they're simply not capable of going through that takeoff into industrialization that was the prerogative of the advanced economies. So what you get is uneven development in the sense both of where wealth is concentrated, good jobs are concentrated, you get winning regions and losing regions. And if policy is simply aimed at promoting that development, then you're simply going to reinforce that level of inequality. Now, people like Thomas Piketty in France have pointed to the massive growth of inequality on a global scale over the last 25 years. And I wouldn't argue with that. I would argue that the trends that we're seeing, the mythology that we're seeing emerge, would actually only serve to reinforce that growth of inequality rather than do anything about it. Can you do something about it? The second part of your question, well, yes. And you begin to see parts of it in things like dealing with the gig economy. There have been attempts, for example, in California to try and control the gig economy. I mean, even the Labour Party in Australia, in a very, very, very little way, has pointed to the fact that the jobs that the gig economy is producing are fairly rubbish jobs, frankly, and that the governments need to step in to do something about that. There is also, as the European Trade Union Institute has pointed out, a massive reaction around the world in the gig economy against the Uberization of the labour market. And workers are going back to a very old form of organisation. It's called trade unions. And this is happening not just in the old economies, it's happening in Australia, but what's interesting is it's also happening in places like China, where wages are growing because workers within China are beginning to organize and beginning to demand better terms and conditions, which is one of the reasons why industry in China is moving to countries like Vietnam, because the wages are even lower in Vietnam than they are in China. It's going to need a concerted attempt to counteract these forces, but that's going to have to be people organizing in their own communities, in their own workplaces. It's going to take governments at state and federal level to act against the forces of uneven development that I talked about, the growth of inequality that I talked about. It's going to need a concerted and united attempt, but it's far from impossible. We've done it before, we can do it again. That's
great. That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for your time. The article is published in the Economic and Labour Relations Review. That's all. Thank you, Al.
Thank you, Michael.